Oh, hello everyone. A warm welcome from the enmacc offices in Munich. It's great to see so many back to this episode. Today we'll talk about the future of the power markets. So last time we talked about gas. We're looking more at the short-term impacts of the volatility and the price rises. Now we have more the long-term view versus 2020 on how power markets are developing or probably developing, because I think it's needed that we look as well on the long end of the curve to see what kind of price signals do we have to encourage investments and as well hedging in the long term. So that's why we invited Eirik Torhaug to us, live from Oslo. He's with us, a Senior Analyst of Refinitiv, and he will present today, I think the first time, their long-term power market model and all the factors which go into that and how they derive their view for the long-term perspective on the power market. Eirik, happy to have you here, directly handing over to you, and as well waiting for the response and the questions from the audience later on. So I will pick up all the questions if you put them into the Q&A functionality or the chat of the Zoom, and then we have a great discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks, Jens. I'll just share my screen here. Let's see. You see my screen now?
All good?
Good.
Ready.
So, as you already alluded to, we in Refinitiv have spent quite some time in the recent year and a half on constructing some scenarios for long-term power in Northwestern Europe. So I'll basically go through give an introduction to our model and the inputs, some of the outputs, and as well as some analysis. But first, you already introduced me, but just quickly about myself. I'm Eirik Torhaug, and I'm a Senior Analyst at the Power Research Group at Refinitiv. And I've been mostly working with the long-term scenarios. So this is the agenda for today. I'll briefly go through our power model, just scratching the surface there in order for everyone to understand what kind of model we're dealing with. Then I'm going to go through some trends in Northwestern Europe with respect to the phase out of coal and nuclear, as well as the increase in renewable build-out going forward. Then we'll take a deep dive into weather. At Refinitiv, we have a great expertise in the weather, both short and long term, and this is probably one of the biggest uncertainties going forward, also in the long term. So that's what we've been focusing mostly on in the modeling when we've created these scenarios. So I'll look into a bit about how we make these scenarios and why we think that the weather is such an important part of the future power market. And then lastly, I'll just go through some analysis that we've made from our model runs. So starting with the model itself, why did we create this? Well, we wanted to create a framework to be able to quantify all these rapid changes in the European power sector. As you're all aware, lots is going on this decade that we have ahead of us. So with the coal phase out, nuclear phase out, and renewable build out, how will this affect everything from the price to the security of supply to flows, all of this? And we wanted to be able to have a flexible setup where we could do a lot of sensitivity analysis, where we could change input parameters. After all, I mean, the future is very uncertain when you go far out on the curve. So we think the best way to approach this is to run different scenarios to be able to quantify the impact. And thirdly, we wanted to be completely transparent with our inputs and our assumptions. So that's a big part of our modeling approach. And then lastly, we want to share all the inputs and outputs with our customers to create value for them so that they can use the input into their own models, as well as make their own analysis and the judgments based on the outputs. So just briefly, where you can find it in Icon, which is Refinitiv's data platform. So I won't go into there, but here you can find all the inputs and outputs that we use. As you can see on the right-hand side, this is the current scope of the model, the CWE and Great Britain area. We are planning to expand this going forward, firstly to Spain, Italy, and Poland. The model runs once a month. So we run it on the first Saturday of the month to ensure that we update it with the recent developments in fuel, etc. Just quickly on how the framework works, what kind of inputs we have. We have renewable generation scenarios, which we get from our in-house wind and solar models, which we also use to predict the short-term weather or short-term wind and solar output. And the same for consumption. This is also our in-house consumption model. So we basically feed in historical weather data to create and make assumptions regarding the capacity to create these renewable scenarios. I'll go deeper into these later on in this presentation. Then we also need the thermal and nuclear availabilities on the unit level. We solve the problem, the day-ahead problem, all the way down to on the unit level. We have a pretty extensive facility database, which contains basically all the facilities that participate in the day-ahead market. So that's an important input there. Obviously, NTCs on the borders between the countries as new projects and interconnectors come online. That's also an important input, and also the fuel and carbon price development going forward. Here we have been pretty have a simple approach. We use basically the traded market prices at the time of the model run. We don't do any assumptions on the fuels. The model itself, it's a linear programming model, which basically emulates the Euphemia algorithm, which is the day-ahead or the algorithm that clears the day-ahead market in many or most of European countries these days. And what it basically does is it solves the day-ahead generation dispatch problem for each hour from now until the end of 2030. As outputs, we obviously get the prices. We can also derive the capture prices from this. We also get the border flows, the generation by type for each country by source, as well as since we do this on a unit level, we can extract the CO2 emissions also, and also the fuel burn. All of these is per for each weather year that we use, so 25 weather years, and also in an hourly resolution. Just quickly going through. To try to, I think it's important to understand what we're actually doing with the model here to understand why we get the outputs that we do. So what the model basically does, it finds the least costly way to cover the residual load in each country. So that's demand minus wind, solar, and run the river for each hour. So to have the supply-demand balance at all times. So the variables of the model is the output of conventional power units, that nuclear, coal, gas, lignite, which is capped at their available capacity, and also the flows between the areas. So the model tries to find the least costly way to cover the load with the help of these generation units and the flows between the areas. Each of the units that we use has a marginal cost based on the efficiency of the unit. And since we have a very detailed facility database, we can make a pretty realistic stack there. And it also has a startup cost based on the fuel and a minimal stable generation. So these are input parameters to the cost minimization problem. We find the area price for each hour by finding the cost of generating one more megawatt hour of energy in that particular area. So that could also be interpreted as the marginal cost of the output of the power plant, which is producing on the margin. And we solve this in sub-problems in 1 week, so we optimize 1 week at a time all the way to 2030. So yeah, just looking a bit on the on some important trends going forward in Northwestern Europe. If you look at the coal capacity going forward, we see a big decline in a lot of the countries. Obviously, Germany has a very big stack to begin with, so they see the brunt of the decline, but also other countries, France, Great Britain, and Netherlands has still coal in their generation mix, which is expected to be phased out going forward. So that's a bit about coal. I mean, 25 gigs is pretty substantial, and if you look at the nuclear capacity in the same areas, the story is very similar. Germany has their phase out starting already at the end of this year, with 4 gigawatts going offline, and another 4 gigawatts at the end of 2022. And Belgium has a target of phasing their entire nuclear fleet out by the end of 2025, so that's another 6 gigs. And Britain also have signaled several units going offline at the start or in the first part of the decade, before actually building a couple of units at the latter part of the decade. When it comes to France, the real powerhouse when it comes to nuclear capacity, we have commissioned 1 unit, the Flamanville unit, at the mid 2023, before keeping the nuclear fleet stable for most of the decade, and then decommissioning 2 units post 2029, as France tries to become less dependent on nuclear going into the next decade. If you look or take a closer look at Germany, after all, this is where a lot of the changes is going to happen, with both phasing out coal and nuclear at the same time, which I don't think there's at least in Europe another country doing the same thing. But what we basically do here is that we have the individual units, the closure times for nuclear units, so that we incorporate in the facility database. The same goes for the lignite fleet as well. Here we have known decommissioning dates for individual units, so that's incorporated as we go along. For the hard coal units, we have incorporated the results from the coal auctions that have been published. And then we have after the coal auction results, we linearly scale down the coal stack between the 2 target dates set by the German government. So we scale it down, taking out the least efficient plants first from 2023 until the target number in 2030. So going over to renewable build out here, we've mostly relied on TSO forecasts when it comes to this trajectory. We expect wind and solar capacity to double by end of 2030. So substantial gains there as well. If you take Germany for an example, we have used the medium-term prognosis from the TSOs there until 2025, and then at the end of 2025 we have linearly increased the capacity to line up with the target set by the EEG in 2030. Yeah, that's a bit about that. Yeah, we also expect large additions of interconnector capacity to be added in the region going forward. We have mainly relied on projects stated in the 2020 10-year network development plan from NSOE. So we basically incorporate these projects as they are stated to be completed in their plan. Here you can see, for example, the projects that we are considering for France, and you can also see how we incorporate how the NTCs on each border increases as the projects complete. Yeah, we can look a bit deeper into the weather. I don't think there's an understatement saying that the weather will play a very important role in the future power system. So as we go forward, conventional generation will be phased out and renewable build-out will increase. So a large part of the demand has to be covered by these non-dispatchable sources, which are completely dependent on the weather. And this creates a reliance on the renewables to be able to maintain the supply and demand balance. What we see in our simulations is that this causes increasingly frequent periods and higher magnitude of these events where there are a lot of generation surplus and deficits. So I'll take a bit of a closer look at Germany when it comes to these two points. Here we have what our model foresees when it comes to the fossil fuel production and the wind and solar. Historically speaking, obviously, you can see on the left here, fossil fuels have dominated quite a lot. And then in 2020, we actually saw wind and solar surpassing fossil fuels for the first time. But this was a very special year, I would say. I mean, with the COVID demand destruction, and also it was an exceptionally windy year, historically speaking. So our model doesn't foresee this to happen again until 2024. And a large part of this, or a reason for this, is the fact that we have the nuclear phase out, which starts. So in order to cover the load, we foresee that these fossil fuels will have to ramp up once again. So we won't see renewables dominating until 2024. And this is in our scenario average. So the average of all the weather years. There could be differences, or there are differences when you compare the individual weather years, but this is the scenario average. And as I mentioned before, as we go further up in the curve, solar and wind just becomes completely dominant, taking a bigger part of the generation. The second point that I made earlier, we see that when we simulate with extreme weather scenarios, where there's very little wind, for example, on the left-hand side here, we've simulated the 24th of January 2030 with weather year or the weather from 1997. And what we see is that for some hours, there are just the need for quite a large amount of flexible assets, whether that be batteries or new gas peaker plants or demand side response. We've been pretty agnostic to what will cover that. We just see that there's a great need to have that in place when that time comes. And also the other side of the coin is when more renewables come in, we see this large surpluses going forward. So here we simulated the 28th of April 2030 with weather from 2003. And what we see is just a massive amount of generation from wind and solar, so much so that it's not even possible to export the surplus. So we end up basically with, in this case, 19 gigs of too much renewables in 1 hour. And this just really emphasizes the need and value and the importance of having a flexible power system that can deal with both of these extremes. Here's a pretty interesting one. I think what we found out when we did these scenarios is that it really doesn't suffice anymore to only use an average year where you take a couple of years and then average the weather in those years and input that into the model. We see that if we do that, we basically see no need to build out any capacity because these extreme weather events don't happen when you compress all the scenarios into one. You don't see the extremes. I mean, that will probably lead to wrong decisions when it comes to not only investments but also the security of supply. So I would just emphasize the fact that it's super important to simulate with the historical weather years. As you can see on the right hand side here, for one single, this is I've just graphed all the weather years that we simulate, the highest amount of flexible capacity that our model sees for one given hour, and it ranges from around 11 to upwards to 26 gigs for the worst case scenario, with the average being around 15 gigs. So what's the implication here? As I already mentioned, in order to analyze the future power system, in our opinion, you need to have high resolution real weather scenarios to be able to make any kind of accurate assessment. And we have made, coincidentally, we have made some very good in-house scenarios for both consumption, solar, and wind, which are based on 25 actual weather years. So I'll talk a bit about how we made these. So basically, as I mentioned before, we have this. We have our fundamental models, wind and solar, which run on forecast data from different providers, but we can also run historical weather years through the model to get capacity factors from this based on the weather of that year. So a capacity factor is a number between 0 and 1, which says something about the output for that weather. And then we can apply our own capacity assumptions to these capacity factors, and from that get hourly scenarios for each country. Now, these are country specific. And also another good thing is that we make these capacity factors available so that people can make their own assessment on the capacity that they believe will happen forward. So it's pretty flexible in that way. I see I'm running a bit out of time here, but if this is just to show how big of a difference it can be between weather years. So in 2030, if we take the worst case and best case, it can be up to 58 terawatt hours in our scenarios, difference in wind and solar output. Looking at consumption, we have our own model here as well, and we feed historical weather in here to create 25 weather scenarios, consumption scenarios here as well. And the model accounts for holidays and weekends in addition to seasonality, of course. It's important to highlight that this is the public grid demand. So this is excluding grid losses and self-consumption as well as pumped hydro. And our assumption has been, this is probably, we think maybe it might be a bit conservative, but still this is our base case with 0% growth year on year from now until 2025. And then from 2025 to 2030, we have a 1% CAGR for each year. And the reasoning behind this is that we think, at least partly, the efficiency gains that we've seen in the last couple of years will counteract the increase in heat pump demand and electrical vehicles, as well as electrification of the industry. But as we go further out on the curve, the efficiency gains aren't enough to keep these electricity demand trends in check, and we have applied a 1% CAGR for all countries. So just a couple of key analysis that we made. So I'll talk both about our base case scenario, which is basically the inputs or the trends that I've been discussing so far, as well as some sensitivity analysis that we've made with carbon. Carbon, instead of being the traded price, it's the forecast from our carbon team. And we also dabbled with a more rapid coal phase out in Germany, where we also combine this with 50% higher solar capacity and 26% higher wind capacity in 2030. So starting with the base case, this is basically the emissions from the countries that our model sees. And what we see is that in our base case, the amount of emissions comparing 2030 and 2022 is that there is 60% less in 2030 than in 2022. So quite a massive decrease. Obviously, a lot of this is coming from Germany, which is has the biggest polluting stack right now, with lignite and coal playing a big part. And as this is phased out, their emissions goes down accordingly as well. Looking at how the weather, since we simulated with all these weather years, all our inputs are also in for every weather year. So this is, for example, the gas generation the model sees for each of the different model of the weather years in Germany. And as you can see, there's quite a big difference here as well between the weather years. 55% difference. This is something I think is pretty cool as well, that you not only the inputs but the outputs can also be checked based on the individual weather year. Another thing that we're seeing that we find interesting is the fact that Germany will become a net importer following the nuclear phase out. So traditionally, as you can see from the graph, Germany has been a net exporter of power, but following the nuclear phase out, we see the net import steadily increasing to around 90 terawatt hours in 2026 and staying stable at this level until the end of the decade. And here's the sensitivity analysis with respect to the carbon price. You can see on the right-hand side here, you see the traded carbon price, which we use in the base case, and also in indigo color here, our Refinitiv EUA price forecast. So quite a big increase compared to the traded one, especially after 2025. And what our model actually sees is, based on this, the German power sector emissions actually decreases by 12% compared to the base case. And that's due to the fact that obviously it gets more expensive to produce from more emitting sources as coal and lignite. And what we actually see is that the import increases to fill that void. The last analysis I'll present is this more rapid phase out of coal, which there has been no speculation about in Germany. So we basically, instead of seeing 8 gigs of hard coal at the end of 2030, we see 0, and instead of 9 gigawatts of lignite, we see 0. And for wind, we see we have increased the capacity by 24 gigawatts and the solar by 50 gigawatts. And what we see here with respect to the prices is that there is a much larger spread between the weather years as the share of renewable increases. So on the left-hand side there, you see the base case, and on the right-hand side, you see the rapid transition. So in the base case, we have 13 euros in 2030 for the yearly price difference between the weather years. But as the share of renewables become more and more dominant, we in the rapid transition case, we see that it can actually be as much as 22 euros of a spread. And that's it from my side. So I'm happy to take some questions.
Eirik, thank you very much. Very interesting. I think from the input parameters you draw in, and as well to the results. Happy to take some questions from the audience. I have some first ones I would love to pass on to you. You mentioned the big need for flexibility in the system coming through power generation, or other kind of flexibility, could be batteries as well, or storage. Have you made any assumptions about how much storage or batteries we will have in the power system in 2030?
That's an excellent question. We haven't made a specific research when it pertains to batteries, but that is actually one of the next things on our agenda to create a module which includes batteries.
Mm-hmm. So that's probably the most complex one, to create the business opportunity for batteries, and then seeing as well the effects on prices, how it's dampening the volatility again.
Exactly. That's a tough modeling challenge, but I think we are equipped to do it.
Very good. Then you mentioned as well, take one question here regarding the weather. I mean, first of all, it's important to take these different kind of years into account to see really the variety of outcomes on the market, being a strong predictor as well for the volatility at the end. One question: is it enough to look in the back, or do you need to have as well predictions about how weather is developing? Because we all know that with global warming, weather is not the same anymore. So how does that influence your model, or can we incorporate that in the model?
That's again a very good question. I think, for the time being, we rely on historical weather data, but as you say, I mean, things are changing. So yeah, it's definitely worth looking into how you could, but it's difficult to predict how it will look like in 10 years or 5 years, but if you start to see trends where it doesn't the wind doesn't blow as much as it has done historically, stuff like that, then obviously one would have to revise the approach for it to make it to be valid.
Okay, very good. Maybe drawing as well connections to two of the other major markets we are in. I mean, the one is the emissions market. I mean, could you take us a little bit through the carbon price forecast, which is your analysis based on? Because that draws quite some interest here. How much is this influencing at the end the power price level?
Yeah, no, that's we actually haven't seen, when we ran this analysis, the price level wasn't that different. So it was surprisingly small when we ran this analysis.
So you're saying it's not a major driver of price increases or as well the volatility?
At least not with the inputs that we have had. Then we didn't see. Obviously, there is an impact, but it's not like 40 euros. It's more like a couple of euros.
And on the demand side, if I understood you right, basically the demand for gas for power generation is an output variable of your model in a way. Can you shine a little bit of light on that? How would gas demand from the power generation sector develop over time following the model?
That's we do have that ability to extract the fuel that's being used, but we haven't looked deeply into that. So what I showed was actually the power from gas, so the generation from gas. But I think that's a super interesting analysis to see the gas demand in terms of actual gas.
Yeah. Exactly. I think the demand side predictions as well, or how will they react to different prices, starting with gas as well, but as well on the industry side, how some fuel switching may happen. That's very hard to predict, I guess. And this is why, as you said as well, you have this 1% CAGR going forward. I can imagine that there is still some let's say devil in the details here, and hard to predict. No.
For sure. I mean, that's also one thing that we're going to run an analysis on, different demand growth, because that's a huge driver, right? And there's so many different predictions out there, ranging from 1% CAGR to a lot more. So But we've chosen to be pretty conservative in the demand growth numbers, because it has such a big impact on the overall power system. But we are, as I said, going to run some sensitivity analysis where we check out the effects of increasing demand.
Okay. So we have these kind of more detailed models behind how much comes from e-mobility, what happens in industry. So this is the underlying model is more detailed than it takes care of these, let's say, specific drivers.
Yeah, this has been more of a top down for the time being. But yeah, for the time being, it's been more top down. But for sure, I think a big improvement on our part is to actually delve deeper, bottom up approach with respect to the demand.
Excellent. And there are participants who ask, can you show again the last slide? I mean, where we have really the price curves, and can you maybe, a few more words on these, because this is what ultimately interests most of the participants, really. You remember the last slide where you had basically exactly these kind of curves? Yeah. Eirik, could you a little bit elaborate further on what we see here and how to interpret that? I mean,
okay, yeah, sorry.
You see the strong decline on the left side, basically 22, 23, and then it's stabilizing basically on one level in the base scenario.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's what we can witness at least is following the fuel markets. So starting very high, and then you see there's an obvious linkage there with prices stabilizing as the fuel inputs also stabilize. Yeah,
it looks like quite a stable outlook if we follow the model here. So even the 13 euro difference in 2030 is not that much.
That is true.
Okay. All right. Do we get some more questions here? I tried to cover already most, but feel encouraged to put some more in here if you wish. Maybe one question. What we have seen, especially in the countries which had seen a strong build out in renewables in the past, especially in Spain, that there's a huge difference between the planned capacities or the assumed capacities and the realized ones, where all the technical problems come into play as well, and getting permissions, etc. So at the moment, you say that the TSOs have kind of a solid expectation there, or how do you look at this build-out plan, these build-out plans?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned before, the TSO should have at least some idea. After all, they are responsible for the supply and demand in their area. So we find that their forecast to be the most reliable.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
And overall, I mean, if we take this into account, part of that, we have these big goals to reduce carbon emissions over time. So if I recall it right now, you basically said it's well possible to reduce in this area carbon emissions by 60% to 2030 if everything works well.
Yeah. That's at least what our model foresees. So
okay,
that's
one positive outcome.
Yeah.
Excellent. Good. Let's see. All right. I think we're getting a little bit to the end here regarding questions. I think there are quite some analysis regarding the EUA forecasts and the emission prices. I think this is what you have not touched. It's probably really a separate topic as well, how the fast phase out will influence that.
For sure. I mean, our carbon team has a very detailed analysis on how they came up with this price. It's a bit outside my domain, So I would highly recommend to check out the reasoning behind it.
Good. Yeah. And we'll have as well a separate session on EUAs pretty soon. So I think that's where we can continue the discussion. I mean, what I think is great that you really bring all together these elements into one forecast for 2030, explaining the sensibilities between the different kind of influencing factors and scenarios. I'm sure it's quite fun to play with it, actually, not just around the coal phase out, but there are still many other variables where you can have different views on and how they influence the market. So I think it's extremely helpful to have these models.
Absolutely.
And see how they evolve over the next years. And I think we are just at the beginning of better understanding these long-term effects.
Indeed. Couldn't agree more.
Excellent, Eirik. Thanks a lot for today. It was a real pleasure to have you, and hope to follow up soon with you and see how the model evolves and what kind of learnings we can draw from it. Thanks to the audience as well for the participation. As I said, EUAs is on the agenda pretty soon. We'll come to that back again, and hope to have you again here on in these next episodes here of our Digital Trader Summit. Thanks everyone, and have a great day. Bye bye.
Thank you.